Much like the Lich Horror stalking its world, as a game, Hunt Showdown is a lesson. Just because you think something's dead doesn't mean it really is. And here in its arisen form, Hunt Showdown really has its own harrowing story to tell. Helmed originally by Crytek USA, who you may know as Vigil Games, famous for the Darksiders series, Hunt Horrors of the Gilded Age, as it was originally titled in 2014, was revealed as a third-person co-op shooter with Diablo-like elements and rearranging levels. Fast forward a few years after the now famous financial troubles and the unfortunate shuttering of that Austin studio, Hunt Showdown, as it is now called, is reborn as an in-house title developed at the main Crytek office in Germany, this time as a slow-paced, atmospheric first-person multiplayer game with a unique PvE and PvP core. As much as I find it a bit sorrowful to say, I can imagine that the crucible of those troubled times has melded and changed Hunt Showdown into a game which I earnestly think emphasizes those historical strengths of Crytek games. That is, where technology of the CryEngine is more than just window dressing, and the presentation aspects of the game form a foundation for the gameplay. I found myself really surprised here at the quality of just everything, and was atmospherically engrossed in a multiplayer shooter. That doesn't happen too often. And the atmosphere in this game is really where it all starts. See, a lot of your time in Hunt Showdown is spent traversing, sneaking, and surviving with limited resources across the many handcrafted areas of the gameplay map. Your goal is to find clues to the locations of boss creatures, banishing them, and then escaping whilst avoiding or killing other two-player PvP teams. It is slow burning, brutal in short spurts, and manages to actually startle. And fashioned after a turn-of-the-century Louisiana bayou, you make your way through the grime and decay of it all, fighting AI-controlled undead creatures and former humans. And let me tell you, this is one bleak and wretched place. Statues are stained black with eldritch weeping lines. Brackish water and hazy fog obscure hidden dangers. The cries of dying horses, murders of crows, wasted dogs, and broken glass or hanging chains alert anything and anyone to your presence. So much of the gameplay here is designed around this auditory visual experience, playing with what you can see and hear, and what others can see and hear of you. The Hunt soundscape builds tension in ways that reminds me much more of a single-player game than a multiplayer one. Even with that being said, it's not just limited to the tension building, as the audio-visual design means visually satisfying and aurally punchy gunplay. The game on startup recommends playing with headphones, and well, I wholly agree. But as I mentioned, it's not just the sound of the game, but the graphical techniques used here which contribute to this all too important atmosphere building. As I cursorily highlighted in the tech-focused video on ray tracing, the CryEngine has supported sparse voxel octree global illumination for years now, allowing for light to bounce around environments in real time, creating secondary shadows and nice relighting areas which would otherwise only be directly lit. So take the inside of this shack here. Notice how the light from the sun is bouncing off the boards, here lighting up areas not touched directly by the sunlight. Or here, look at how the denser areas of the woods in between the trees become progressively and crushingly darker where light cannot penetrate them. This kind of lighting in real time is not really found in games all too often, and the Hunt utilizes such rare lighting technology to enhance the gameplay. Often that extra darkness and realism afforded by the global illumination leads to some unique gameplay moments. Take this snippet here, for example. In this scene, I'm so concerned with the undead group in front of me that my eyes naturally do not notice the hulking corpse husk creature hiding in plain sight, as the convincingly rendered shadows make it not catch my attention really. Or here in this scene, as I turn around this bend after having cast a flare to see, here that extra realistic dark of night in the deep woods from the global illumination masks a zombie to my right, even though I looked right at it for a moment. I only reacted in time due to the stereophonic nature of the audio. Moving beyond global illumination, the game also makes use of volumetric fog to a great degree, punctuating the dusty air and decayed indoor areas where light shafts illuminate particulate matter in the air, or at night when you toss out a flare to see ahead and you can see its shafts of light poke through the leaves of the trees. Having this kind of experience from audio and dynamic lighting in a multiplayer game where high-end technology enhances the gameplay in an atmospheric way is rare, and I really think it deserves praise here. And of course, like any good Crytek game, you can expect lots of parallax occlusion mapping and neat effects like GPU particles and screen space shadows for good measure. But do these high-end effects come at a cost on hardware that is too much to bear? Well, to a degree they kind of do. Hunt Showdown is a PC-only game at the moment in its early access state here on Steam, a fact which the game lovingly reinforced to me when I tried to experiment with its current non-existing controller support. So this game is full-on keyboard and mouse, baby. Oh yeah. But I think that PC-only nature here has allowed them to push up the base graphical effects to the degree they have, which is of course reflected in the system requirements, as well as the effect it has had on the graphics menu of the game. It is a multiplayer shooter we're talking about here, so the PvP nature means the game needs to have an even visual playfield for all players. This is a dual-edged blade, of course, given how much the graphical makeup of the game affects the gameplay itself. Imagine if a player could turn off global illumination, or volumetric lighting even. They would be able to more readily spot players in otherwise hidden areas, or those that are obscured by beams of light. So this means that the graphics in the end are not very individually customizable. Though this has a positive effect where players going for low graphics also get much of that full graphical package just with lessened internal resolution and fidelity for all the game's effects. And there are really only 3 graphical presets in the game at the moment: low, medium, and high. Beyond this, you have the ability to toggle off motion blur and depth of field, as well as change anisotropic filtering, but seriously, just leave it at 16x and forget it. You can also choose between 4 different anti-aliasing presets with SMAA 2TX, SMAA 1TX, SMAA 1X, and then just off. SMAA 2TX utilizes previous frames to super sample the image, giving a clean look to many of the game's edges at the cost of some ghosting trails behind certain moving objects. SMAA 1TX is normal single frame SMAA, but one that blends pixels along with their movement in the camera direction, so they flicker less. And then SMAA 1X is that normal post-process anti-aliasing we're used to at this point, and it really only works with information from one frame. Here I recommend going with SMAA 2TX, no matter what it is, as it's not that much more expensive, being only 3% slower than SMAA 1X and 4% slower than AA set to off, and its clean image quality is worth the occasional ghosting in my opinion, which is much less visually invasive at 60 FPS. Speaking of 60 FPS, should your rig not be up to the task of that or higher, you can always use the in-game frame rate limiter here to lock down to 30, which thankfully actually is wonderfully smooth in terms of frame pacing and actually works properly. Although, like most games at 30 FPS, the mouse is going to feel like it's moving through molasses. But getting over to the differences between low, medium, and high, as I said, you really will not be toggling off effects wholesale by going down to low in this game. Rather, merely reducing the internal resolutions and their fidelity. So going down from high to medium and then to low sees the internal resolution and range of global illumination taking a hit, making it blockier and more prone to flickering on screen movement. You also see that same reduction of quality in the screen space directional occlusion as well, giving a slightly striated appearance to some of the game's darker corners. You will also see a loss of parallax occlusion mapping from high to medium. Low also brings down the range and resolution of shadow map cascades, making them less defined. Going from high to medium also sees penumbra shadows being turned off, meaning long shadows far from the caster are sharp no matter what, and low shadows are just unsharp all the time. Similarly, keeping motion blur on and changing the graphical presets also reduces motion blur quality, with the low setting being less visually contiguous than high and having a visible sample pattern. But for the most part, everything is still there and intact. The only effect that I could really find being completely lost on though was screen space reflections on opaque surfaces. This has that knock-on effect of making environments glow a bit more as they lack that reflection occlusion that SSR provides. But you still get to keep the screen space reflections on water volumes on low, which have that excellent, stretched, smoky look regardless of settings. The biggest visible change though from going from high to low comes from its effect on level of detail distances in the game. As a means to save performance, the range at which higher quality models are drawn in comparison to their lower quality ones, is massively reduced when going down from low, from high, and even from medium. So as you approach objects in the game world on low, you see them rapidly changing form and geometric dimensions in comparison to high, making the world less visibly stable, and it can actually be a bit distracting as things kind of just pop in. Performance-wise, the step from medium to low is greater than that from the step from high to medium. On a rig with an NVIDIA GTX 1070 with a Ryzen 1700X at 3.9 GHz and 16 GB of 3200 MHz DDR4, I saw around a 10% increase in performance over high by going down to medium settings at 1080p, and a performance increase of 14% or so when going down from medium to low. So going from high to low at 1080p in this configuration meant gaining around 25% performance. Turning off motion blur at the highest settings saw a 4 to 5% increase in performance, and turning off depth of field had really negligible performance consequences. The performance difference meant that playing at 60 FPS at the highest settings on this 1070 was really only possible at 1920 by 1080. 1440p on the other hand necessitated a reduction to low settings to be below that crucial 16.6 millisecond window. Even then, there are moments at 1080p where I saw GPU utilization being dangerously high when trying to lock to 60 FPS here. Moving up to 4K, only the lowest settings were capable of maintaining 30 FPS, with or without motion blur. So yes, on the highest settings, Hunt Showdown is a rather heavy game on the GPU, but even with all the settings reduced to their lowest at 1080p, I still found myself CPU limited below 120 FPS on this Ryzen configuration. So those of you targeting a high refresh rate of 120 or more in Hunt Showdown will need a CPU with a much beefier single-threaded performance than this one. Moving on to a more mid-range Intel PC, I also tested the game on a Core i5-8400 with 16 GB of 2667 MHz RAM, and either with an MSI NVIDIA GTX 1060 or an MSI AMD Radeon RX 580. The takeaway from these tests is that the game defaults to low graphics presets for a reason. The GTX 1060 found itself unable to reach 60 FPS on high at 1080p and was still being constantly below 60 FPS even on medium. Only on low was a fully constant 60 FPS really possible here, though in the end I think medium with a good GPU overclock should allow for a more or less stable 60 FPS on the GTX 1060. Like in other CryEngine games, the GCN architecture of the RX 580 fared better in the same weight class. Unlike the GTX 1060, the RX 580 spent much more time above 60 FPS at the highest settings at 1080p, and it was basically 100% locked 60 FPS at medium settings, and low fared proportionally better as expected. I would imagine the difference in performance here we are seeing between these two cards comes from the compute shader reliance found in this game's Forward Plus renderer, and how the global illumination also heavily uses GPU compute. The GTX 1060's performance here is a bit disappointing at the moment, so I hope we can see some driver updates in the future to help this out. Or perhaps that's just the lay of the land, so to speak, for mid-range Pascal cards and CryEngine. Either way, this game is pretty heavy on the GPU, so come in with expectations checked. If you want to run it at 60 FPS on the highest settings at above HD resolutions, you're going to need something a lot bigger than a GTX 1070. If not that, there's always that 30 FPS limiter to fall back on. Since this game is still in early access on Steam, I would ask Crytek here to implement some finer-grained graphical options in the future, as the current limited set does affect performance, but there's too little choice as to how. It would be great if users could choose which effects they would prefer to reduce the fidelity of, rather than have the choice be forced and only be limited to coarse presets which affect everything at once. Being able to separately reduce global illumination fidelity from, for example, level of detail distance would be awesome. So there you have it. Hunt Showdown, as it currently is in early access, is a multiplayer game with atmosphere and feeling of a single-player one. I think this is really due to how the technology and presentation so finely interweaves with the gameplay. I also think it should be really stressed that I personally found myself completely immersed at times, forgetting that I was reviewing the game's technical aspects as I was just merely engrossed in playing it. And so maybe that also happened to you while watching this video. Probably not. But either way, thank you for taking the time to watch it, and if you did find yourself immersed in its content, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you are already subscribed, hit that little bell button in the corner to be notified as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you would like to talk with me about any of the aspects of this video or just game graphics in general, follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. As always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.